We remember Vikings as fearless raiders, masters of the sword and sea. But what history rarely whispers is what came after the battles ended? When the last prayer of a dying monk faded and the smoke of burning chapels rose into the dawn, the true horror began. Not for the fallen warriors whose torment had ended, but for the nuns who remained. Women who had sworn their lives to Christ now faced a nightmare that made death look merciful. You think you know Viking brutality. Even the sagas fall silent on what came next. We've all seen the movies. Dark stone chambers lit by flickering torches, iron maidens lined against damp walls, the rack creaking under the weight of screaming victims. Medieval torture, we're told, was an endless carnival of sadistic invention. But what if most of what you think you know about medieval justice is fundamentally false? The truth is far more mundane, and in some ways, more disturbing. Because the real medieval justice system wasn't designed to inflict maximum pain. It was designed to control you, to shame you, to make you confess in front of your neighbors. And it worked not through elaborate mechanisms of agony, but through the simple, devastating power of public humiliation. If you want to understand how history gets weaponized, twisted, and sold back to us as entertainment, subscribe to this channel. We're cutting through centuries of myth to find what actually happened. And let me know in the comments, what's the biggest medieval torture myth you've heard? This episode draws from primary legal records, archaeological evidence, and the work of historians like Edward Peters and Larissa Tracy. Medieval law wasn't about rehabilitation. It wasn't even primarily about punishment in the modern sense. It was about three things: extracting confession, maintaining social hierarchy, and deterring others through fear. The entire system rested on a simple premise: truth could be forced from the body, and justice must be seen to be done. Understanding this context is crucial. Medieval society operated on a fundamentally different epistemology than our own. Truth wasn't discovered through investigation. It was revealed through ordeal, oath, or confession. Physical evidence meant little. What mattered was the sworn statement, and if you wouldn't swear voluntarily, methods existed to encourage you. The public nature of medieval punishment cannot be overstated. Justice wasn't administered behind closed doors. It happened in the town square, in front of your neighbors, your family, the people you'd see at market tomorrow. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was social engineering through shame. Walk into any medieval town square, and you'd likely find them, the stocks and the pillory. Not instruments of torture in any dramatic sense, but tools of communal judgment. The stock secured your ankles while you sat. The pillory held your head and hands while you stood. Both left you completely vulnerable to public ridicule. These devices were used for what we'd now call misdemeanors. Sold watered-down ale, 3 hours in the stocks. Caught drunk and disorderly on a Sunday. A day in the pillory. Baked bread under the legal weight. The pillory, with the offending loaf hung around your neck. The punishment wasn't the physical restraint, though hours in an uncomfortable position certainly caused pain. The punishment was the humiliation. Your neighbors, the people whose respect you needed to conduct business and maintain your reputation, could mock you freely. They could throw rotten vegetables, excrement, sometimes stones. The authorities usually looked the other way unless things got lethal. Court records from 14th century London show that stocks and pillory were used hundreds of times per year in a single city. This was the everyday face of medieval justice. Not elaborate torture chambers, but simple wooden restraints designed to destroy your social standing. In a world where reputation meant survival, where your word was your bond and your honor your currency, this was devastation enough. The psychological impact was profound. You weren't just being punished. You were being excluded, marked as untrustworthy, transformed from neighbor to spectacle. And everyone watching learned the lesson: conform, or face the same fate. Medieval justice was deeply gendered, and nowhere is this more evident than in devices specifically designed to punish women. The scold's bridle, also called the brank, gossip's bridle, or witch's bridle. emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries. Technically early modern rather than medieval, but rooted in medieval concepts of female subordination. The device was an iron framework that enclosed the head, with a metal plate or spike that pressed down on the tongue, making speech painful or impossible. It wasn't designed to extract confession or punish crimes in any legal sense. It was designed to punish women whose speech was deemed problematic: nagging wives, gossiping neighbors, women who talked back to male authority. The charges that led to the bridle were remarkably specific and gendered. A woman could be bridled for scolding her husband, for spreading rumors, for being too loud, for cursing, even for defending herself too vigorously in public disputes. In other words, for violating the medieval expectation of female silence and submission. The woman would be locked into the bridle and paraded through town, sometimes for hours. The message was clear: this is what happens when women forget their place. Records from Scotland and England show hundreds of documented cases, with the practice persisting into the 1800s in some areas. What makes the scold's bridle particularly revealing is that it wasn't even pretending to serve legal justice. It was naked social control, a tool for enforcing gender hierarchy through ritualized humiliation. No trial was necessary, no formal sentence. A magistrate or even a husband could order it. The woman's crime was simply being female and vocal. To understand how medieval societies ended up using pain and humiliation as legal tools, we need to understand the philosophical shift that occurred in the High Middle Ages. Earlier medieval law relied heavily on trial by ordeal. Walk across hot coals, sink or float in water, swear an oath with your hand on holy relics. God would reveal truth through miracles. But by the 13th century, this system was collapsing. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 forbade clergy from participating in trials by ordeal, effectively ending the practice across much of Europe. If God wouldn't reveal truth through miracles, humans would have to extract it themselves. Enter judicial torture, not as sadistic entertainment, but as legal procedure. The logic was straightforward: physical pressure could force truth from the unwilling. Of course, this logic was deeply flawed. Pain makes people say whatever will make the pain stop, whether true or not. But medieval legal theorists convinced themselves they could distinguish true from false confessions. This shift marks the real birth of what we think of as medieval torture. Not the legendary chambers of the Inquisition, but the regulated, documented, state-sanctioned application of physical pressure to extract sworn statements. It was bureaucratic, methodical, and terrifyingly ordinary. The public spectacle of punishment served a dual purpose. It satisfied the legal requirement that justice be witnessed, and it provided a stark warning to anyone else tempted to transgress. Your body became a text on which power wrote its messages. Your suffering became a sermon on obedience. Now we come to the device that dominates popular imagination: the rack. A wooden frame, for posts, a roller mechanism, ropes attached to wrists and ankles. The victim would be stretched, slowly, methodically, until joints dislocated, ligaments tore, and confession spilled forth along with screams. This much is true. The rack existed. It was real. Archaeological evidence and contemporary accounts confirm its use in England, France, and across Europe from roughly the 14th century onward. But here's what the movies don't show: how rarely it was actually used, and how carefully it was regulated. In England, the rack could only be employed by direct warrant from the monarch or Privy Council. Records from the Tower of London show fewer than 80 documented instances of the rack being used across more than 2 centuries. Compare that to the thousands of criminal trials conducted in the same period. The rack wasn't routine, it was exceptional. Why so rare? Because even medieval legal theorists understood the fundamental problem with torture. It produces unreliable evidence. A person in extreme pain will say anything. They'll confess to crimes they didn't commit, implicate innocent people, fabricate elaborate conspiracies, whatever their torturers want to hear. The rack was typically reserved for cases of treason, heresy, or threats to state security, where extracting names of co-conspirators was deemed essential. Even then, confessions obtained under torture had to be repeated freely afterward to be legally valid. In practice, this requirement was often ignored, but its existence reveals that medieval jurists weren't entirely ignorant of torture's limitations. Contemporary accounts describe the rack's use in bureaucratic, almost clinical terms. There were regulations about how many turns of the crank were permitted, requirements for documentation, sometimes even the presence of physicians to ensure the subject didn't die mid-interrogation. This wasn't sadism run wild, it was state violence administered with paperwork. The psychological impact may have exceeded the physical. The rack was often most effective as a threat. Simply showing a prisoner the device, explaining its function, could produce confession without a single turn of the wheel. Fear accomplished what actual torture might not. And now, the most famous torture device in history, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg. A sarcophagus-shaped cabinet with a hinged front. Open the doors, and you'd find a hollow interior lined with iron spikes. Close the doors with a victim inside, and the spikes would pierce the body, carefully positioned to avoid vital organs, ensuring a slow, agonizing death over hours or days. Terrifying, ingenious, perfectly medieval, and completely fake. The Iron Maiden is a fraud, not a medieval device at all, but a 19th century fabrication designed to thrill tourists and sell tickets to sensationalist exhibitions. The most famous example, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, was constructed in the early 1800s from pieces of various medieval artifacts cobbled together into something that looked ancient and ominous. There are no authentic medieval documents describing the Iron Maiden. No trial records, no execution accounts, no contemporary illustrations. For a device supposedly used across Europe for centuries, this silence is damning. Compare that to the rack, the wheel, or the scaffold, all well documented in legal records, chronicles, and art. The myth emerged during the Romantic period, when Europeans became fascinated with their own supposedly barbaric past. The Gothic was in fashion, horror was marketable. Entrepreneurs created torture museums filled with devices that looked medieval but were actually contemporary inventions. The Iron Maiden was the star attraction. By the late 1800s, torture museums were common across Germany and Eastern Europe. Many devices on display were built specifically for these exhibits, constructed from old iron, artificially aged, and presented as authentic. The Iron Maiden was simply the most successful of these fabrications. It looked how people thought medieval torture should look: excessive, elaborate, almost absurdly cruel. Even the name is suspicious. Iron Maiden doesn't appear in medieval sources. It's likely derived from German Eisern Jungfrau, itself possibly a 19th century coinage. Some scholars suggest it may be confused with or deliberately conflated with the Schandmantel or shame barrel, a very real but far less dramatic punishment device that was essentially a wooden barrel with head and arm holes worn by public drunkards. The actual Iron Maiden of Nuremberg was destroyed in an Allied bombing raid in 1944. Post-war analysis of similar devices in other museums consistently dates their construction to the 18th or 19th centuries. We've been horrified by a hoax. The Judas cradle supposedly worked like this: a pyramid-shaped seat, sharp point upward. The victim would be suspended above it by ropes, then slowly lowered onto the point. Weights could be added to increase pressure. The device would be rarely cleaned, ensuring infection. Death could take days. It sounds medieval. The problem: we can't actually prove it is. Solid documentary evidence for the Judas cradle's use in medieval times is essentially non-existent. The device appears in some late Renaissance sources, particularly from the 17th century during the height of religious wars and witch trials. But clear medieval documentation, the kind we have for the rack, the wheel, or even hanging, simply isn't there. What we have instead are later descriptions, often third-hand accounts, sometimes in sensationalist pamphlets designed to demonize religious or political enemies. During the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, both Catholics and Protestants eagerly publicized the alleged atrocities of their opponents. Many historical torture devices first appear in this propaganda, not in actual legal records. This pattern repeats across many supposed medieval torture devices. The breast ripper, the pear of anguish, the Spanish donkey, all described in lurid detail in early modern sources, but remarkably absent from medieval legal documents, execution accounts, or contemporary chronicles. It's possible some of these devices existed in limited, localized forms. It's possible they were used occasionally by rogue authorities. But the evidence suggests they were far rarer than popular culture claims, if they existed at all in the forms we imagine. The medieval torture chamber, as we picture it, is largely a myth, a creation of later centuries, designed to make us feel superior to our ancestors, to give us the thrill of horror without the guilt of participating in actual violence. We've turned medieval justice into entertainment, stripping away context, exaggerating cruelty, and inventing devices that never existed. The real medieval justice system was brutal enough without embellishment. Public hangings, floggings, brandings, mutilations, all well documented and genuinely horrific. But these methods were mundane, common, unglamorous. They don't make for good museum exhibits or Hollywood films. So, we invented better stories. We created the torture chamber of our nightmares, populated it with ingenious devices of suffering, and projected it backward onto the Middle Ages. In doing so, we learned less about medieval people and more about ourselves, about what scares us, what fascinates us, and how easily we believe lies when they're packaged as history. If this video challenged what you thought you knew about medieval history, subscribe to this channel. We're dedicated to separating myth from reality, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be. And let us know in the comments, what other historical myths should we investigate next? The past is darker and stranger than fiction, but only when we're willing to look at it honestly.